The calendar invite came through at 8:14 a.m. with the subject line, "Quick check-in." It wasn't unusual for Claudia Renshaw to schedule last-minute meetings, but something about the phrasing felt off. By 9, I was sitting in her office under the heavy silence of someone who already knew they weren't going to like what came next. Claudia didn't waste time. She never did. She tapped a printed email twice for effect and said, "I have confirmation you interviewed with Ardent and Vale last Thursday. Your system access has been revoked. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your things." There was no conversation, no explanation, not even a pause to ask why. My name is Serena Holt. I was head of client services at Vericon Communications for 6 years. In that time, I took a mid-tier book of business and built it into a portfolio that represented over a third of the firm's revenue. I negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, retained high-risk clients, and was the quiet name behind every major renewal our board celebrated. But none of that was brought up in the room that morning. Claudia spoke only of loyalty, as if staying silent while being passed over for 3 consecutive years somehow defined mine. I stood up slowly, adjusted my blazer, and extended my hand across the desk. "I wish you and Vericon continued success," I said. My voice was calm, deliberate. Claudia looked at me like she was expecting something else. Tears maybe, or pleading. But I had given this place everything I had, and in return, I had been reduced to a calendar invite and an escort to the elevator. 2 security guards followed me as I packed a few personal items into a cardboard box. My coffee mug, a stack of notepads, 2 framed photos, and a small paperweight I had received as a thank you from our largest client. That was all it took to erase 6 years. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't going to give them the story Claudia was hoping for. I walked out as if it were just another lunch break. The sunlight hit hard as I stepped through the glass doors for the last time, box in hand, the city already awake around me. Claudia believed she was cutting me off mid-leap, halting a move I hadn't yet finished. What she didn't know was that I had already landed. She just hadn't caught up yet. If you're still here, maybe because you've walked out of glass doors like that before, or maybe you're wondering how far someone can go when they stop waiting to be seen. Leave a trace. Let me know where you're listening from. And if this feels uncomfortably familiar, subscribe. You'll want to hear how this ends. At 1:42 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Elias Varn, CEO of Ardent and Vale Consulting. "Can we move our meeting to today? 2 p.m. works on my end." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to, because this wasn't an application anymore. This was a conversation that had already begun. 3 years of overlooked requests. 3 years of silence that I turned into structure. I wasn't walking away from a job. I was walking toward something else. And this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. There's a kind of silence that settles in when you realize your best work has been misread as compliance. I didn't notice it right away. In the early years, I thought loyalty was a language people eventually learned to speak. I told myself Vericon was just slow to reward, not unwilling. But looking back, the signs were there. They just weren't loud. My first raise request came 4 years ago. I had just renegotiated the Kestrel North account, a contract that had been on the brink of collapse until I stepped in. What followed was a 2-year extension, a 20% spend increase, and public praise from the client's CEO. I brought that success into my annual review, backed it with numbers, market comparables, and internal growth metrics. Claudia smiled, nodded, said all the right words, but when the compensation letter arrived, the number hadn't changed. "It's not personal," she told me when I asked. "This year's budget is tight, but your contribution has been noted." I accepted it, not because I believed her, but because I believed in the long game. I thought being patient would pay off. That next year, when things were better, I'd be at the top of the list. The following year, I brought in 3 new accounts, launched a cross-platform campaign that won an industry award, and led a crisis response that saved one of our longest-standing clients. When I walked into that review, I didn't just ask. I presented. Spreadsheets, growth percentages, competitive ranges. The numbers were clean, the story clear. "Next year will be better," Claudia said, as if she were reciting a script. "Leadership is focused on infrastructure investment right now, but we see you." That phrase lingered, "we see you," as if acknowledgement alone could compensate for the hours, the output, the outcomes. What I saw instead was a company that had leased a new floor in the building, upgraded all executive hardware, and issued holiday bonuses to departments that hadn't landed a single client. Claudia had traded in her car, again, but for me, there was nothing, not even a symbolic adjustment. It became clear that tight budgets only applied selectively. Still, I stayed. I kept telling myself it wasn't the right time to walk away. I had a team to protect, clients who trusted me, systems I had built that no one else fully understood. I knew that leaving would mean watching it all fall into someone else's hands, and I wasn't ready to see that. But the third review changed everything. 6 months before Claudia fired me, I secured a new contract with Kestrel North, a 40% increase in spend, and a multi-year agreement that positioned Vericon for long-term stability. It was the kind of deal that would have made headlines if we were a public company. When I walked into that year's review, I didn't feel nervous. I felt certain. Claudia didn't even look at the documents I brought. "Your performance is exceptional," she said, "but this year we're investing heavily in digital transformation. Let's revisit this in the summer." Something shifted in me then. Not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. I left the office, opened my laptop, and updated my resume for the first time in 6 years. Not out of spite, not because I wanted to threaten anyone, but because I realized that waiting any longer would only teach them how much I could tolerate. That night, I built a file labeled Personal ROI. It wasn't emotional, it was operational. Every campaign I had led, every dollar I had brought in, retention metrics, renewal rates, internal savings from process redesigns. I wasn't going to use it to prove anything to Vericon. I had already done that. This was for me. To remind myself that if I didn't know my value, I had no right expecting anyone else to. I didn't send applications the next day. I spent a month researching the firms I respected. I watched how they treated people. I tracked who they promoted. I filtered ruthlessly. When I finally reached out to Ardent and Vale, it wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated shift. I had spent 6 years building results I never weaponized. Now I was choosing where to take them. The irony is, I wasn't planning to leave without a conversation. I wanted to wait until I had a formal offer. I wanted to give proper notice, document the handover, and exit cleanly. But Claudia found out first, and when she did, she responded with exactly the kind of control I had been quietly working to step away from. By firing me, she thought she had regained power. What she didn't realize was that she had given me something far more useful: a clean break. I had managed the Kestrel North account for nearly 4 years. It wasn't assigned to me because I asked. It was handed to me when their previous account manager resigned mid-quarter and no one else wanted the mess. The relationship was strained, the contract under renegotiation, and their CEO had already requested a meeting with other agencies. I took the handover silently, cleared my schedule, and flew out that same week. What happened in that first meeting wasn't dramatic. No big gestures, just careful listening, clean reports, and direct follow-ups. Elias Varn, their CEO, watched closely and said very little. When we wrapped up, he shook my hand once and said, "You listen better than most." That was the extent of the feedback. The next quarter, they renewed. The quarter after that, they doubled their budget. They never asked for a different point of contact again. Internally, people noticed. Externally, no one needed to. The account became stable, quiet, predictable. Exactly how high-value relationships are supposed to feel. Claudia liked to refer to it as a team success, but she also began inserting herself into meetings again. Always toward the end, always with a casual, unnecessary comment that suggested involvement. I didn't push back. I didn't need to. Kestrel kept writing my name into every renewal form, every scope change, every project kickoff. The day after I renegotiated their long-term contract, a note came in from their COO. "Continue with Serena. No change to primary liaison." It wasn't personal, it was procedural, but it was also clear. So when Claudia fired me, I knew exactly what she would do next. She would attempt to take over the account herself, assuming the relationship would hold simply because the contract still lived inside Vericon's database. She wouldn't say anything to Kestrel about what had happened. She'd try to frame it as a transition, smooth, normal, not worth attention. But high-trust clients don't operate on internal schedules. That morning, while I was still carrying a cardboard box to my car, I received a message from Elias. "Are you available today at 2 p.m.?" I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. There was only one reason he would reach out directly, bypassing the usual scheduling channels. He wasn't asking for an explanation. He was verifying what he already suspected. When I arrived at Arden and Vale's building later that afternoon, the front desk already had my name. Elias met me at reception himself. We didn't speak much. He led me to a conference room, closed the door, and opened a folder on the table. It wasn't a briefing. It was a job offer. There was no interview, no small talk, no performance review. "Your professionalism is one of the reasons we waited," he said. "What happened this morning only confirmed the timing." The title was Director of Client Strategy. The scope included building and leading a team across multiple agency relationships, Kestrel North included. The salary was more than double what I had requested in my last denied raise at Vericon. I read the offer carefully. I didn't sign immediately. I told him I'd return with a decision in the morning. He nodded. We both knew what the answer would be, but some things are worth doing with formality, especially when the people before you discarded that standard altogether. That night, the folder sat unopened on my kitchen table, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted space to let everything settle, not the firing. That was done. But the weight of what came after. Claudia had assumed the client would stay. She had assumed the contract mattered more than the person behind it. But what she never understood, what Vericon never asked, was who actually kept the trust intact during all those renewals, restructures, and difficult quarters. They measured volume. I maintained consistency. The relationship didn't belong to Vericon. It never had. There was one suit in my closet I had never worn to Vericon. It wasn't saved for promotions or office parties. It was the kind you kept for days when you needed to walk into a room and leave with the air changed behind you. Navy, tailored, sharp at the waist, subtle in every way except how it made me feel. Precise, intentional, ready. I wore it the morning after I left. The offer from Arden and Vale sat unopened on my kitchen table overnight. Not because I needed more time, I already knew what I would say, but because I wanted to mark the moment properly. Leaving a system that had defined your worth for 6 years wasn't something I rushed. Some exits deserved silence, others clarity. At the front desk of Arden and Vale, they didn't ask for ID. They greeted me by name. The assistant walked me up, no badge, no wait. Elias was already standing when I entered the room, but we didn't exchange formalities. The paper was signed and returned within minutes. There were no negotiations. Everything that needed to be said had already been proven elsewhere. By noon, I had a corporate email, an onboarding schedule, and a welcome note from the strategy team. There was no photo op, no announcements, just structure. Quiet, fast, efficient. Later that day, my phone began to light up. Not with congratulations, but with fragments of a story I already understood better than anyone inside that building. A few former colleagues messaged to say that the company had called an emergency all hands. Claudia had framed my departure as a breach of loyalty, reinforcing a narrative about company values that had little to do with how loyalty was actually measured behind closed doors. Others mentioned she had been in her office all day, doors closed, pacing. Her calls were longer than usual. The energy on the floor was tense, uncertain. I didn't reply to any of the messages. Not out of spite, I just didn't owe the story any oxygen. The next morning I received a call, not from HR, not from Claudia, but from a member of the board, someone I hadn't spoken to since presenting a quarterly review 2 years earlier. Her tone was neutral, almost clinical, but what stood out wasn't the words, it was the timing. She asked if I was available for a conversation. I said I could make time the following day, not to return, not to negotiate, but because I understood what it meant when a system that had ignored the cost of silence suddenly wanted to speak. After we hung up, I stood in front of my closet and reached for the same navy suit. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted the room to remember how I looked the moment they realized I was no longer theirs to manage. The Vericon lobby looked exactly the same potted plants, same overhead lighting, same badge scanner that once logged every late night I stayed behind to salvage a project no one else wanted. But walking in as a guest shifted everything. The familiarity felt distant, like revisiting a place you once knew but no longer belonged to. I signed the visitor log. No one asked questions. Jessica glanced up from the front desk and gave me a look I recognized. Not pity, not curiosity, just the quiet respect of someone who had watched everything unfold without saying a word. I nodded back. No words were needed. Upstairs, the conference room hadn't changed either. Polished glass table, leather chairs, a whiteboard no one ever used but refused to remove. I sat across from Margot Winter, one of the board members I'd met only once, years earlier during a client portfolio review. She had a slim folder in front of her. It was closed. She didn't start with small talk. She didn't recap my file. She simply said she wanted to understand how a key account director had exited so suddenly, and why that exit had triggered client unrest within 48 hours. I let her speak. The room felt measured. No urgency, but no denial either. Someone had connected the dots, and now they were retracing the steps Claudia had taken without board oversight. I didn't need to fill in the blanks. My absence had done that already. She mentioned there were 3 formal salary adjustment requests on file. None of them ever escalated to the board. There was no documentation justifying my termination. No flagged violations. No compliance concerns. Just one note in HR. Breach of internal trust executive decision. That was it. One sentence. It wasn't anger I felt. It was confirmation. For 3 years, I had submitted reports, negotiated contracts, and grown client revenue without demanding recognition. I had assumed someone up the chain would notice the value eventually, but systems built on avoidance rarely reward quiet contribution. They only react to absence. Margot stated that the board had reviewed my case and wanted to offer reinstatement. The title would be adjusted, the compensation revised. There would be room for negotiation if needed. I listened carefully, then I declined. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I had already made the decision days earlier, long before this meeting was called, before Claudia realized what she had set in motion, before anyone noticed that the client relationship didn't belong to the company anymore. Margot didn't press. She simply asked what Vericon could have done differently. I gave her the only answer that felt honest. They could have looked closer, sooner. As I left the building for the second and final time, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt done. Done waiting for people to recognize value only after it had exited the room. Done making space in systems that had none to offer in return. Done speaking quietly and hoping that silence would translate to trust. Claudia hadn't expected this call to come, but she had written every line of it herself. I didn't announce anything, no post, no press. The offer from Ardent and Vale had been signed, the systems were live, and the calendar had shifted quietly. I had no reason to tell anyone at Vericon, and certainly no interest in how they interpreted my absence. But clients always notice when something changes. 3 days after I joined Ardent, I was copied on a thread titled, Kestrel Transition Internal Only. It was short, structured, and precise. Kestrel North had reached out requesting a review of their current agency relationship, citing internal instability and service inconsistency over the previous month. The message didn't mention names. It didn't need to. Attached were summaries of recent campaign delays, incomplete deliverables, and gaps in communication, none of which had existed when I managed the account. At the bottom of the thread was a single line from Ardent's VP of Client Strategy. Serena, can you lead transition planning if requested? By then, the shift was already in motion. I opened the documents, reviewed the structure, and flagged a few items the team might overlook. All of it was familiar. Every approval flow, client preference, and performance nuance. It wasn't about control. It was about context. I had built these systems once. I knew where they worked and where they broke. Kestrel didn't ask for a new agency. They asked for better consistency. They asked for clarity. They asked for me. When the formal termination notice was sent to Vericon, the language was clean and unrecoverable. Kestrel thanked them for their years of partnership and requested all materials be transferred to Ardent by end of week. The decision had already passed board approval. There would be no reversal. Claudia wasn't addressed directly in the communication, but I knew she would read between the lines, especially the part where Ardent named me as the incoming lead for all future strategy and execution. I didn't celebrate. I built a transition plan, timelines, owners, contact sequences. I spoke with Kestrel's operations lead and briefed my new team on the brand's history. I submitted a resource map before noon and drafted a continuity model that aligned with their upcoming fiscal calendar. This wasn't vindication, it was operational clarity. The work moved forward, without disruption, without debate, and without Vericon. No one at Kestrel mentioned what had happened. No one asked why I was gone. They never needed to ask. They had already made their decision, and their decision was movement. That was the difference. Vericon waited until something broke before asking what it had cost them. Kestrel moved before anything had the chance to. The first sign came in the form of calendar updates I was no longer part of. Someone at Vericon had added 3 emergency leadership huddles to the executive team's shared schedule, all labeled internal alignment. A few former colleagues, still connected on old project threads, shared the updates quietly. Not as gossip, just context. Everyone could feel the weight shifting, but no one wanted to say it out loud. By the end of that week, the Kestrel transition was no longer a rumor. It was a fact. Ardent's onboarding team had finalized access. Legal had completed the contract review. Asset migration was scheduled. The only thing Vericon could do was comply. There was no announcement inside Vericon. Claudia didn't acknowledge the client loss publicly, but small signs broke the surface. The account team that used to support Kestrel had their weekly meeting pulled. 2 team members were reassigned with no explanation. A third quietly left. The silence said more than any memo could. From where I stood, nothing about it felt dramatic. Kestrel had simply moved on. They weren't angry, just efficient. And in that efficiency, Claudia's position began to shrink. When you remove a $30 million anchor from a system built on appearance, the drift is immediate. Budgets don't balance. Forecasts stop adding up. People ask questions. Questions about who approved the staffing plans, about why certain roles were still funded, about performance baselines that no longer applied. I didn't ask for any of that to happen, but the numbers I once held in place were no longer there to speak for themselves. Inside Ardent, I stayed focused. The team had stabilized. Strategy was moving. We were preparing for a mid-quarter campaign shift that required my direct oversight. My calendar filled with review sessions, feedback loops, and creative approvals. But Vericon kept showing up. In emails I wasn't copied on, in projects I didn't touch, in spreadsheets where my initials still lived in the formulas. Then someone sent me a forwarded email. No subject line, just a screen grab of Claudia presenting at an all-staff meeting. The slide behind her was titled, "Resilience Through Change." Beneath it, bullet points outlined new structures, a redefined leadership model, and a promise to double down on what we do best. But no one asked what that was anymore, because the work had already walked out the door. I learned from a contact in finance that Vericon's board had quietly frozen Claudia's discretionary authority. No terminations, no restructures, no spending approvals without secondary sign-off. The same autonomy she had used to remove me. Gone. Not with a confrontation, not with a scandal, just removed. There was no meeting, no warning. She had lost the room. And it wasn't because of one decision. It was because for too long, her decisions had depended on the assumption that the foundation would hold, no matter how often it was ignored. People began pulling old numbers, performance charts, audit logs. They weren't looking for Serena Holt. They were looking for the version of the business that made sense, and mine was the last name still attached to it. Internal credit is a currency that moves quietly. It isn't listed in reports. It doesn't show up in pay slips. But inside organizations, it's tracked constantly. Who secured the client? Who saved the contract? Who made the quarter close? And once that credit attaches to someone, it's hard to dislodge, even when they're no longer there. After the Kestrel transition, Claudia moved fast. She revised decks, shifted attributions, removed names from old campaign retrospectives. Everything that had once included my initials was reworded, stripped down to team-based language or rerouted to collective leadership. She repackaged the last 2 years into a narrative of cross-functional wins, strategic direction rather than individual execution. From the outside, it looked clean. But internally, the systems didn't cooperate. Finance still used my models. Client ops still referenced the naming conventions I built. The audit trail on the CRM couldn't be edited. Project files bore metadata that wasn't just labeled, it was owned. The folder names were mine. The version logs were time-stamped. And the approvals, the ones that mattered most, still carried my signature. The things I had done quietly, documented, consistent, thorough, were now the only things Vericon could rely on to defend past decisions. Claudia had underestimated that part. She had spent years presenting herself as the driver of strategy, the visionary behind growth. But vision without execution is fragile, and when things began to crack, no one went looking for speeches. They went looking for data, and the data kept leading back to me. One of the board committees requested a breakdown of the Kestrel portfolio over the last 3 fiscal years. The request bypassed Claudia entirely. Someone in internal audit began mapping campaign outcomes to staffing logs. The questions weren't about creativity or energy or alignment, they were about retention, risk, forecast accuracy. And when the team pulled the record of renewals, crisis recoveries, and expansion moments, my name wasn't next to them. It was under them. Approval authority, execution-led, escalation point. Everywhere Claudia had tried to erase me, the system had quietly archived proof. She didn't respond directly, but her behavior changed. She stopped attending team retrospectives, stopped hosting office-wide syncs, her public calendar emptied. She shifted visibility to smaller internal meetings, smaller but more frequent. She tried to reassert control by volume, not direction. But volume never holds long, especially not when those in the room remember who actually got things done. I didn't watch any of this unfold in real time. I didn't need to. The few people who still sent updates weren't doing it for gossip. They were sharing because they knew what it meant when credit couldn't be reassigned. Inside Ardent, I focused on the transition. The handover had completed on schedule. Kestrel had begun submitting early-stage concept briefs for the next fiscal year, and our team was mapping out creative sprints. There was no mention of where the work used to be, only where it was going next. And that, more than anything, marked the end of the debate. Because by the time people start asking who built the foundation, it's already too late to claim the credit. Long after the transition finalized, my inbox still held echoes of Vericon. Not directly. No one wrote to ask me to return. No one apologized. That was never the culture, but patterns began to emerge. Questions about documentation I had authored, workflows I had implemented, reporting dashboards I had quietly standardized years ago. They came from people I had trained, or people who had inherited what I built without knowing its origin. They weren't reaching out to reconnect. They were reaching out because the system still worked, and they didn't know why. That's the part no one sees in exit memos. The structure someone leaves behind becomes part of the organization's reflex. It informs how things are done long after the name has been deleted from the org chart, and in time it becomes the baseline against which all new work is measured. Claudia didn't reference me again. She couldn't, but she stopped trying to revise the past. The deck she presented began to reuse older phrasing, more conservative forecasts, fewer bold initiatives. The language became careful, contained. Someone told me the company stopped naming internal projects after leadership team members. A quiet change, no announcement, just a shift away from attribution altogether. Meanwhile, at Ardent, the platform we built for Kestrel's account had started to scale. Our internal operations team requested a walkthrough. Then another team asked to replicate our intake process. Within 6 weeks, a second account had adopted the same tracking structure. Then a third. By the end of the quarter, it had a name, one I didn't choose, but one they used anyway. The Holt model, not branded, not public-facing, just 3 internal words attached to a system that worked. I didn't comment when I heard it, didn't correct it. I had built the thing to last, not to be labeled. But I understood why they needed the name. Because once something works, people want to believe it came from somewhere. Even if that somewhere no longer has to show up in the room. 12 months after I left Vericon, someone forwarded me a slide. It was from an internal presentation, one of the end-of-year retrospectives that used to be Claudia's stage. The deck was clean, minimal colors, structured by quarter, but one slide had survived the changes. Q2, Client Recovery and Strategic Transition. Beneath it, a bulleted list. On Kestrel North Revenue Risk, Client Confidence Rebuildings Process Stabilization Based on Former Model Strategic Recovery Timeline, led externally. There was no name attached, just one line of small print in the footer. Structure based on legacy implementation, reference files maintained under original architecture. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because of what it meant. Somewhere inside that company, someone had tried to delete the history, to rewrite it, reframe it, dilute it, and yet this remained, a remnant of the foundation. Unnamed but unerasable. No one had invited me back. No one needed to. Because I was already present in every system they still depended on. Every version they couldn't overwrite. Every format they couldn't replicate from scratch. That's the part they never understood. You can remove a name from payroll, but you can't delete competence from infrastructure, not when it holds everything up.